Hello, welcome. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome to a special edition of a show on Sangat TV today. Today we're going to be discussing the threat of terrorism and extremism in local communities in the UK. I'm joined today by two very special guests, Mr. David Anderson, QC, Independent Advisor to the Government on Terrorism Legislation, and Mr. Jaswant Bora, Community Activist and Coordinator in the Midlands area. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Mr. David, if I can start with you. What's your role as the terrorism legislation reviewer?
Well, we have a lot of anti-terrorism laws in this country, and they used to be renewed every year by Parliament because they were such serious laws that Parliament needed to have a look at them every year. Although that doesn't happen anymore, Parliament still wants somebody to have a careful look at how those laws are being operated and to advise them, have we got the right laws? Are they being applied correctly, or are they being counterproductive? Are they unnecessary? Are there gaps in the protections that the laws give us? And my job is to report 3 times a year, both to the Home Secretary and to Parliament, on the operation of those terrorism laws. I also give evidence quite a lot to parliamentary committees, and I try to build up some expertise in the terrorism laws and how they function.
And do you have a background in terrorism legislation or usage of?
I'm a barrister, member of the English Bar, a QC, and when I was asked to take on this job 2 years ago, I had only done one terrorism case.
Right.
And my client, believe it or not, was somebody who the British government thought was a friend of Osama bin Laden.
Right.
So the point of my job is a man called Qadi,
right.
a Saudi citizen.
Indeed.
The point being that I'm an independent person. I'm not part of the government, I'm not employed by the government, and they want a fresh pair of eyes who is not part of the counter-terrorism machine to come in and have a look at how it's working.
Well, not a vested interest, so to speak.
Exactly, yes.
Right, but just one thing. What is your background? How do you relate to the terrorism legislation and its effects on the community?
Just to give you a bit of a background. My background has been initially started with youth work around about 94, and then working down. I worked in CAMS for a couple of years within a particular role with children, young people and families, and then subsequent to that I got involved working with a bit of criminal law within a firm within Birmingham. Yeah. And alongside that, I started to work with young people, issues of antisocial and offending behaviour, and obviously helping to reduce that within areas like Dudley, which was recognised in the local news for responses. And also, stemming from that, around 2008, I was initially working within the youth offending criminal justice area, and was asked on the back of what happened in 7/7 with the government and giving funding and focusing around specific areas of delivery.
The London Tube bombings.
July 7/7. Yeah. To work and deliver sort of the agenda within the criminal justice system. So roughly from about 2008 to about 11, and stemming within that, I became a bit more independent around doing some own research, training, events and conferences in around Birmingham and the wider UK.
What did that involve? When you say you got involved, in what sense? With the youth?
Yeah, with young people. Yeah, there was
particularly vulnerable to extremism.
Yeah, there was a lot of risks and concerns at the time of post 7/7 for people who were at risk of getting radicalised. Within the criminal justice system.
Are these students or just youth in general?
Just youth in general, because obviously the main age group is around 10 to 17, border 18 within the yachts, and everything above that would be probation. And obviously there's all other community, other areas that got involved within their kind of roles and responsibilities of delivering it, but primarily within the criminal justice system. Between 10 to 17 also, there were big risks at that time for some who had been radicalised both within the UK and out the UK to deliver it, and then the threat was quite prominent at the time.
David, if I may, how does the criminal justice system or the terrorism legislation in particular, how is it targeting and what is it actually doing to prevent youth from being radicalised and influenced by extremism?
Well, the main thing is that all terrorism is also crime, and most acts of terrorism are punished under the ordinary criminal law. Which in my view is just as it should be. Yeah. The reason we do have some specialist terrorist offences is because the threat of something as bad as the London bombings, or worse still, the 9/11 incidents, is such that we consider that with terrorism you can have some laws that go a little bit further back. So with an ordinary crime like assault or theft or something like that, you can be convicted of attempt, you can be convicted of conspiracy to commit the crime, but you can't be convicted for something going further back. You might buy an implement to break into a house, for example. That's not a criminal offence. With terrorism, we have some crimes that go further back. So you can commit an act preparatory to terrorism.
Indeed.
That might even be buying an air ticket to the place where you're going to commit the act, or assembling the ingredients of a bomb. And you also have offences of possessing material, for example, that might be useful for terrorism. So some of these very unpleasant online magazines that are produced by extremist Islamists in the Yemen, you find in possession of one of those and you're in trouble with the law. But ultimately, it seems to me, and you use the word prevent terrorism, you can do so much with the criminal law. You can bang people on the head, you can tell them be quiet, you can tell them don't do this, but you're not ultimately going to solve the problem that way. If we're going to get rid of terrorism in this society, and it will go, because all terrorist movements have a beginning and an end, and eventually we will see an end to it. It seems to me it has to be through the community. The state can do a certain amount to empower the community, to give them the tools, but ultimately it seems to me it's a question of moderate people from all backgrounds, all races, all faiths, getting together and making common cause against the extremists, wherever they're from, whatever the colour of their skin, whatever their beliefs, who believe in furthering their aims by violent means. And that is just something that is completely unacceptable. And it needs to be clear to those people that their own communities consider it completely unacceptable.
Do you think they do?
Well, I think yes. I think, of course, anything to do with terrorism captures the headlines. And there have also been some quite dangerous plots that, thanks to good intelligence and good policing work, have been foiled. But if you look back, and you mentioned, Jaswant mentioned the London bombings of 2005, since that time, certainly until this year, when there have been a couple of quite well publicised murders, one in the West Midlands and of a man coming back from the mosque, one in London of drummer Lee Rigby.
Indeed.
In those 8 years, there has not been any deaths caused by terrorism in this country. So although the threat is a worrying one, and although the potential scale of these incidents is very large, I think it's important to keep it all in perspective. We have got strong laws, we have got good intelligence, we have got good policing, and the number of incidents that we're seeing on the ground is very small indeed.
Very small, yeah, it is. Would you say Lee Rigby and the man coming home from the mosque and whatever, would you say that's organised terrorism, or would you say that's individuals acting in a terroristic manner?
Well, I couldn't say that about either of those cases, simply because neither of them has yet come to trial, even though people have been arrested and charged. And I would say, I made the point earlier that terrorism is crime, and I think it's very unlikely that a jury will ever have to decide whether those were terrorist acts, because the men involved have been charged with murder, because that is ultimately what it was. Murder is the most serious crime we know. It carries a penalty of life imprisonment, and if convicted, that is the penalty that those men will be given. And
the actual terrorism legislation, you say it needs reviewing every 12 months. You're the one that compiles a review of that and reports it to Parliament and the Home Office and the Prime Minister?
Yes. And you can find the reviews on my website.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a handful. It's Independent Reviewer of Terrorism Legislation, but you can find me if you Google that. Or I'm on Twitter at Terror Watchdog, which is a bit easier to
on Twitter.
Remember. But anything I'm doing, I publicise on Twitter if people are interested.
But otherwise, David Anderson, QC, Google that and it will come up anyway.
Yes, all sorts of stuff will come up, but one of them will be my website. Yeah.
Brilliant. So your reviews, every 12 months, your recommendations, how often are they accepted?
I would say they're all carefully discussed, and most of them are accepted in one form or another. Some of them simply aren't accepted because the elected government sees things differently from the way I see them, and that's absolutely fine.
Yeah,
they are the democratic
democracy in action
organ, and I am simply someone who is giving them hopefully expert advice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, an insight from a different angle that they're going to need. Just one thing, what's your experience been within the community? Is it prevalent? Is it a problem for radicalisation of youth still?
I think there are concerns that have been identified in terms of vulnerabilities. And as Dave said, to get someone who's a full-blown radicalist, it takes a process and takes a time. I think even the definition given by the government in the strategy in response to 7/7 talks about radicalisation is a process, not so much an event. So there is a journey that an individual will take to become radicalised, and we have to look at it from the perspective of how these terrorists or extremists sort of preying them victims and look for certain routes into that. In terms of the local issues, for me, it has created a lot of kind of or surfaced a lot of issues that have come. For example, community tensions have arisen. The breakdown of cohesion and integration has been threatened by extremism, obviously with the backdrop of EDL and other these groups that are coming up, or more extremist, should I say, rather than terrorism related. But more specifically in terms of 9/11 and 7/7.
But is EDL not a symptom of the actual problem, which is radicalisation of young Asian lads?
But this is the thing about arguing about radicalisation, or we got other words that we tend to use, like the grooming of them.
Yeah.
Obviously, the kind of approach and message that they tend to convey really is defending the kind of the British rights and against Islamic extremism and Sharia law, and we've seen that quite visible on TV and media. That's some of the core principles of their messages. But in terms of a threat of terrorism, I can't really seldom see them anybody coming into that. But in terms of other groups, their response and their birth and the backdrop of terrorism activity, especially within within the UK, and the new concept that came around within July 7/7 and post 7/7 was the threat of homegrown terrorism.
Yeah.
Something that we sort of distanced many years ago, but now it's literally, the war was not so much in Afghanistan.
These are not terrorists that are flying in through Heathrow. These are terrorists born
and bred here.
These are terrorists
born and bred
English
British,
terrorists.
like they said, was it Mohammed Sadiq was the British citizens, weren't they? So with good roles and everything, and so you can imagine it opened up a whole new...
And that's right, we have seen that change towards homegrown terrorism, but I wouldn't want to overestimate it, because if you look at the recent plots that have been detected, there's actually been a link, often with Pakistan, in a large number of them. So, for example, we had the Birmingham rucksack bomb plot a couple of years ago, where I think 12 guys were convicted in the end, and they were intending to detonate 8 rucksacks with explosives. Now, a number of those people had travelled to Pakistan. They'd met Al-Qaeda people, they'd received training of various kinds. Similarly, we've had the military-themed attack, plot to attack Wootton Bassett, Richard Dart and others convicted recently for that. And also the Territorial Army barracks in Luton, which was a different plot. Once again, there are people there who had travelled, or at least who had sought to travel. Now, of course, Al-Qaeda isn't the monolithic, powerful structure that it was. It's very severely degraded in Pakistan. But there are other ways as well of receiving instruction and developing expertise abroad. And one thing the intelligence services are particularly worried about at the moment, I think I can say, is that quite a number of young Muslim men in Britain are going to fight in Syria. Now, some of them might be going with the best of motives. They might be fighting to bring down this tyrant that we're debating whether we want to fight against him as well. But there are a lot of very unpleasant groups, some of them aligned with Al-Qaeda, that are also fighting against the tyrant. It's a relatively easy place to reach compared with other theatres of war, and if you go out there and fight, it's quite easy to get back, and you can learn things out there which, if you are violently inclined, it might be possible to apply in this country. So yes, I mean, there are a few terrorists who are entirely homegrown in the sense that they've radicalised themselves, maybe through watching videos or listening to sermons. And you think of Roshanara Chowdhury, who was a student at my college, King's College London, who bought a kitchen knife and went and stabbed her MP because she didn't like the fact he voted for the Iraq War. Well, I mean, she is somebody who does seem to have really radicalised herself with the help of online sermons. But with most of these radicals, and I'd apply this very much to the Islamists, but I think also extreme right wing, you've got to look at one individual, somebody who has inspired them, motivated them, And very often that will be somebody they've met abroad or someone who's offered to take them abroad.
And offer them knowledge and
Yeah.
wherewithal
Like a schooling, isn't it? Really,
to
it's like a
take out a
schooling
frustration
towards
Yeah.
At what point does the legislation deal with the issue? I mean that in the sense that you have Anjem Choudhury, clearly a radical, clearly looking to influence as many youth as he can. Al-Mujahid Haroon changes his name, is proscribed, is re-proscribed when he changes his name.
Yeah.
He continually changes his name, continues to be operative, yet the law is always 2 steps behind him in a sense.
Well, we have quite strong laws. You could discuss whether they're sufficiently enforced in cases like that, but you're right that Al-Mujahid Haroon and the other organisations that Anjem Choudhury
Because they are a
has
minority.
set up, they're tiny.
The Islamic
they're tiny
community in
groups.
England is really fulfilling its promise of being part of British culture, adding to its vibrancy.
Very few Muslims have any time at all for Anjem Choudhury. His
None at all,
organisations
not
are
anyone I
small.
know.
And as you rightly point out, they are banned. So, for example, when a number of them demonstrated outside the US Embassy a couple of Christmases ago, 25 people were arrested for membership of that organisation. They weren't subsequently charged. Anjem Choudhury himself, it's true, hasn't been prosecuted for these types of offences.
Never.
But the offences are certainly there. You know, if you're inciting racial hatred, if you're inciting religious hatred in a threatening manner, if you're causing people alarm or distress, you know, these are all offences under the criminal law. And if there's a racial or religious motivation for what you're doing, well, that makes it worse. Now, I couldn't comment on whether charges should be brought against any particular individual, but those laws are already there. I think if people talk about strengthening them even further, they've got to be quite careful, because if you aren't careful, you make people even more cautious than they already are in this country about what they say, what they tweet. And if you're not careful, you kill one of the things that I think binds this country together and is a rather attractive thing about this country, which is our ability to take the mickey out of each other.
Yeah, freedom of speech.
And to have a bit of banter. And you think of cases like the guy who was frustrated going through Robin Hood Airport, East Midlands. He was trying to go and see his girlfriend in Northern Ireland, and he tweeted, if this airport doesn't get its stuff together, I'm going to blow the place sky high. Now, he ended up being convicted of a criminal offence, which in my opinion is ridiculous. Or you have people being convicted for describing a police horse as gay and this sort of thing. So I think the law's in about the right place. And it's all very well saying, well, let's criminalise these unpleasant people. I mean, the world is unfortunately full of unpleasant people. But if we criminalise them all, we'd have very full and very expensive prisons. And I think the rest of us would all be rather frightened about what we've said. So it's a question of balance. And people will have their own views. My feeling is we got the balance more or less right at the moment.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear from the reviewer himself.
Well,
you are our balance. You're working with us, for us.
I'm just a person who tries to work out where the right balance is. And there will be different ideas about that. I try to speak to as many people as I can. And of course I read the secret stuff too. And that's the unique thing about the job, really.
And I think that's some of the, just to echo what David's saying, that's some of the things that are being resonate within kind of schools, and having worked in a few, especially with predominantly Asian, white or Pakistani lads, that they'll just see what's gone on post 9/11 and all these events, and in their own rationality, in their own kind of level of intelligence, and determining, differentiating between involvement, they have said quite clearly to myself that they will not get themselves involved with any violent acts as such, though they probably have understandings why people do what they do, whether it be grievances, political issue, whatever they might be. And they very clearly stated that they would think twice now to sort of go out there and just randomly, spontaneously join a particular group without asking a multitude of questions, and that's based upon a lot of work that's been done to a lot of agencies out there, independent people or governing bodies or statutory bodies.
So to have that sort of stance takes a fair bit of intelligence, to be fair.
Yeah, I mean,
there was an MP not long ago who said she could understand the justification of a Palestinian becoming a suicide bomber. It's a few years back. She was chastised for it left, right and centre.
Then they made her a baroness after that.
Indeed, yeah. Indeed. Well. But for a young Islamic child to say he can fully understand why terrorism is happening and still not take part when that's his community, that's a good thing, isn't it?
I think we've to some extent, and I talk as a practitioner as well, is that we probably underestimated the level of knowledge that some of these young people exposed. So, okay, in the days when we were growing up, well, I say we, but growing up when, you know, we just basically had, you know, chalk and board, wasn't it really? So to do any of our own independent research and you know, it was kind of difficult. Now we're talking about a generation now that have been exposed to media, internet, everything, and they will decipher. They'll ask a lot more questions. They'll seek out. We've got libraries galore. So there's a lot of routes and avenues. They will sort of look at that, as well as sort of a few more kind of role models to some extent to sort of help challenge that. And it's what the government did in 2006 with the strategy, is to sort of look at the broader range of expertises out there. Obviously, David's responsibility was within that division, but the broader responsibilities of people out there. So look, I think Charles Farr, the head of OECD, had clearly stated that the review.
OECD?
Office for Security and Counter-Terrorism.
Right.
The Prevent Review, which is the frontline delivery that took place in December, they acknowledged that we can't fight this battle or this threat of terrorism, extremism alone. We have to look at all different avenues, be it parenting, be it safeguarding issues, be it criminal justice, be it education, be it youth work divisions. We have to look at the broader remit, and assess it on that basis. What are the strengths and weaknesses? So they've sort of taken that whole approach, holistic approach, within the kind of a new strategy, and become a bit more focused with the work that's currently being delivered. And
you can do two things basically about poison coming over the internet. You can try and close it down, but it's very hard. You might be able to close a site that's hosted in this country, but if the site is hosted somewhere else, and ironically, of course, an awful lot of them are hosted in the United States, where they have very strict freedom of speech rules, it can be very difficult. So one can do a certain amount is being done, but it is ultimately a losing battle against the tide of information that is out there. And the other thing, and I think this is really what Jacinth was saying, is you can teach people to think. You know, you can try and encourage people to evaluate different ideas, to work out which ideas are worthwhile and which aren't. It's what somebody once called a marketplace of ideas. And you have to trust that if people are given the right skills by their families and by their schools, then they have the ability to sort out the good ideas from the bad. That's not going to work on everybody, but it seems to me that in a mature democratic society, that is actually our best safeguard.
Balanced human beings will
we
be able to differentiate between stupidity and sense.
Yes, and people educated, not just in the sense that they've got lots of degrees, but in the sense that they can think for themselves.
Life experience.
And they don't just do what somebody else tells them to do. And that's really the key, as it seems to me.
Indeed, yeah, brilliant. I was going to touch on something, I'm not sure I should, but if I touch on it a little, by way of an extension to what I actually want to talk about, you've just completed the report on Schedule 7 usage for the David Miranda case at the airport. I'm not going to discuss that at all with you, but you were saying that at the moment, currently, there's a possibility that there's individuals and groups of individuals getting to the theatre of war in Syria. Can a Schedule 7 not prevent those sort of things happening? Because when they do come back, they'll come back with skills, so to speak, that we may not welcome on the streets of the UK. Yeah,
I mean, Schedule 7 is, no one had heard of it until David Miranda was arrested last month, but I've been writing reports on it for 3 years, and it was introduced to deal with the problem of Northern Ireland related terrorism, which is actually true of... but before that it goes back to 1974.
Right.
And in fact before that to 1939.
This is pre-9/11 though.
Yeah, so this is long pre-9/11, and it was operated at the Irish seaports to stop Irish terrorists coming over to London, and as they did a lot in those days, of course, with bombs and explosives and so on. So that's how it was used, and it seems to me that it is still a very useful power, because anybody can be challenged. They don't need to know already that you're a terrorist. They don't even need to suspect you're a terrorist. If they assess that your behaviour is suspicious, or that they'd simply like to ask you a few questions, they can haul you over. In most cases, it's over in 15-20 minutes. In really serious cases, it can last for longer. And there are, of course, issues relating to Mr. Miranda's case and whether it was justified, which are currently before the courts. It's a very useful power. It has produced convictions. It has produced very valuable intelligence. It's also disrupted and deterred people who would otherwise be thinking of trying to bring stuff into the country, or indeed to leave the country to fight. But it is a very strong power. It's quite extreme. You don't have the same sort of protections if you're stopped under that power that you have if you've been
Ironically,
arrested.
you don't have your Miranda rights.
You don't have your Miranda rights, indeed, to take a very legal
Forgive the pun.
And one thing I've been saying in my reports is, without removing this very useful power, are the ways that it could be modified in order to ensure that it doesn't bear too harshly on people, particularly people who might be stopped every time they go through a port or airport.
Indeed.
I mean, there are some people who, for sometimes not very good reason, are just hauled over every time. And I talk a lot to
Does that
Asian
sort of thing,
groups.
is that existent?
It
Even if it's
less
just
than
one
it did.
individual, it does happen though.
It has happened. I mean, one of the problems was the police obviously have their secret databases of people to look out for, and they might stop someone who's on the database and find, no, he's fine. He shouldn't be on the database. But they could be slow to remove the name.
Remove him from the list.
So when he comes back from holiday, he's stopped again, and then when he goes on his next trip, he's stopped again, and he begins to think, well, why are these guys after me? And that can be very distressing. It can also be quite humiliating to be pulled out of the queue.
Indeed.
Particularly, you're wearing a turban and the police say, we'd like to question you. Yeah. And then you go and sit on the plane and everyone's saying, you see that guy in the turban? So it shouldn't be lightly used. It's very good that we have it. But one of my jobs is to recommend changes. And in fact, there is a bill going through Parliament at the moment. It was started before the Miranda incident, but I'm sure it will be debated in the light of the Miranda incident, that will, without weakening the power, provide a few more safeguards for people who are subject to it.
Brilliant, yeah. I just wanted to clarify that because you were saying Syria and there's people
yes, you're absolutely
heading
right.
over there. I was just wondering, is there no way, legislation in place to have that stopped or anything?
Yes, I mean, anyone who is thinking of doing that, particularly if they're carrying anything that could be useful for terrorism, is taking a very big risk, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, Parliament has successfully voted not to be involved with the Syria conflict in any way, other than diplomatically. Is there a danger that foreign policy does create terrorism?
I think there is, and I'm demonstrating here my independence from the government.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the government would tell you that there is no connection between the invasion of Iraq and terrorism. I would say, of course there is. You've only got to look at the content of the suicide notes, for example, of the 7/7 bombers.
Yeah.
And you see in every one there's a reference to the invasion of Muslim lands and American, British arrogance and so on. And you see it in the case of Roshanara Chowdhury, the young woman we mentioned, who went to stab her MP. And she actually described to the police how she was radicalised by going to see her MP and hearing a girl in the group. They were a school group from a school in Tower Hamlets. And her fellow pupil was asking the MP, how could you vote for that war in Iraq? And she began to think, why did he?
How did you vote for that war?
And then 5 years later, this had matured to the stage where she actually became a violent attacker. So, of course, it's no excuse. You cannot allow foreign policy to be any sort of an excuse for terrorism. But has it been helpful to those who want to radicalise our young people? Yes, I'm afraid it has. It's been a very persuasive weapon for them to deploy when they're trying to interest our young people in the idea of terrorism.
And I'm glad they sort of, and what Dave said, I'm glad they sort of put restrictions on kind of public sermons on the streets of London, for example, and they were like, we saw Abu Hamza, with them using that as a pulpit to recruit, and that was literally right in the face, and obviously, I think he was convicted, correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, around it more like hate race. Yeah. So on extremism, from extremism level, it was more to do with fostering hate in communities, also recruit tensions. So if we had that, can you imagine if we had that continuation going on without any laws or measures to sort of restrict that or diminish that, then can you imagine what could have happened? We'll have sort of multitude of people being radicalised without any power. So I've just stopped that, and I'm glad that sort of was enforced as a means and a method. But obviously, still work to be done. Yeah. But at least we are making strides and steps forward. And I think the other areas like local safeguarding documents are being produced in 2010 to look at safeguarding issues and vulnerability there, and the term significant harm keeps coming into these areas as well. To what extent is that, and how can we respond to that? Yeah. So I'm glad that certain measures have been put into place to show us the extent of power that this does have.
Just want your work with the community, your involvement with that work. Would you say there's an issue of terrorism in the wider Asian community, like Tamils, for example, Sikhs? I think accused of terrorism a lot.
I think terrorism within, to make some distinction, terrorism within say
like radicalisation of youth of
I think radicalisation is always a potential, isn't it, for someone to be radicalised, or as David gave the example with the MP, self-radicalised through other means, for example. Yeah. Through the internet, social media, a multitude of avenues.
But is this something you're working on? Is this something that's come to your attention, or do you just think that the potential, rather than the potential being there, is there anything that's come to your attention?
I would say there's greater given the threat of Islamic extremism anyway, within certain groups or racial groups, obviously there's a greater potential or threat than it's going to come from within a particular group. But as history has taught us within this agenda, the case of Nikki Riley was radicalised, was of a kind of white background. So there's some people that have come into the agenda. I think the stereotypes, if I use that word as well, going back post 9/11, was typically it was somebody with a beard and the hat and the gown. So right there he is, that fits the profile. That's shifted, that's altered, that's changed within certain communities now. So are we looking for Glasgow bombers now who were doctors by trade, or are we looking for someone who's been working in school like 7/7? So we have to sort of be a bit more careful in our approach to sort of in terms of profiling what we believe somebody who is a terrorist. Or okay, we can understand the more obvious, someone who's more extremism. We see them at march, have got views, but at the same time to be profiling somebody within terrorism and giving the definition around terrorism, I don't think there's any absolute one to some extent. Who are we looking for now to be able to? So when we're working with people or we're working in groups or we've got projects that are dealing with mentoring and befriending, that's all preventative measures, isn't it, really, to sort of stop it before it transpires. But the challenge we've got now is how do we profile, how do we see, based upon legislation, based upon other agendas and government agendas, how do we, or based on our own perception, we can sometimes alter, how do we really get somebody that fits a category of someone who's been profiled a terrorist or potential to become involved without having a look at their personal issues.
Yeah.
And people of all religions have been terrorists. Hindu, Sikh, Christian. I mean, some of these American...
Described as, or they have been?
What? They have been.
Described as, or they have been?
No, they have been.
They have been.
I mean, if you look at the Oklahoma bombing in the US, you have a white Bible-believing Christian.
McVeigh.
Yeah, who didn't believe in federal government. So, no religion is immune from this kind of thing, and of course some of the worst atrocities of all have been committed by people with no religion at all.
Forgive me, but was he not a part of a militia that's protected by the Constitution of America?
Well, that may be. I mean, they have very generous rules on freedom of association.
They do have,
They can't ban organisations.
They can't ban militias or armed militias for the protection of the people from the government.
There's groups in America in terms of white supremacy or extremism groups for neo-Nazis and all them. For example, I was reading an article that says the dark side to the sunny state of Florida, that has certain groups operating back to freedom of speech and allowed to do so to some extent. And they've had about 97,000 people subscribe to their website, so it's like a newsletter concept. So you can see the vast volumes that they have. But obviously, England may be slightly different too.
Was it not Florida where they were trying to burn the Quran?
Yeah, that was Florida from that pastor within a particular state, which that yet again fueled. I think the case that came in Sandwell of the girl or something to that extent, where it sort of began to open up some tensions within Sandwell. And I was part of that process in terms of sitting around the table and looking at interventions and strategies to sort of how counter that within that particular domain at the time, or that school or that establishment. So there was a ripple effect, and obviously I don't want to do ourselves any justice not saying there is going to be a ripple effect. There will be a ripple effect, there will be some reaction, but it's to what extent, to what degree, because that one case within the Sandwell could have just propelled and become spontaneous throughout the whole of the UK. People could have followed pattern, couldn't they, really? So that in itself was yet again, do we blame the media for portraying that? They could have contained it and isolated it, but they wanted it because it's associated again with the issue around terrorism and extremism.
I think to remember is that these atrocities are committed by very small numbers of very extreme people with whom the rest of the population have nothing in common at all.
Indeed. And
the worst thing we can do by way of reaction is to exaggerate it, to make it into an enormous threat to the existence of our country, which it isn't. And to introduce draconian new laws which have the effect of really impinging on the way we go about our daily business. When we do that, that's really when we give them a victory.
It is that.
And so I think it is a question of remembering, we do have good laws in this country, we do have good police who you can trust, and we do have good intelligence, and we have to hold our nerve.
And I think you're right, David, and this is why the government has said, well, the Department for Communities, Local Government sort of now issuing funding to sort of look at preventative measures, around looking at work more cohesive and working towards integration, obviously around some of these issues, to bring communities together, young people together, families and faiths, so to speak, to sort of work together and become harmonised with a message of peace, really. So there are these things that they have identified, which does obviously give us the evidence that England is working towards it. I think a lot more quicker than what America did. I was speaking to Steve Hewitt, the author on the British War on terrorism, and he also sort of agrees that obviously within England we tend to respond a lot quicker when something tends to happen, and that's actually been proven in the evidence around how the government has made money and things available, resources, training. It's just so spontaneous. I was myself involved in training and delivered training. And that was just literally straight after July 7/7. They said, right, multiple training, They want to get everyone specced up, educated, aware about these issues, and respond to it kind of quick. And I think American system was probably slightly a bit slow post 9/11, apart from what was happening at the administration.
With regards to the military and the Department of Defence.
So they respond to that because it's a national, international crisis, but locally where they came from.
With America, they didn't actually have, well, they still don't have much of a other than the Boston bombings that's just happened. They haven't really got a terrorism threat at home, so to speak.
We had the New York one that was a
Times Square. They had the Fort Hood bombings, the Muslim soldier.
All post 9/11 though.
Yeah, true.
I mean, up to 9/11, they didn't require that. I'm saying.
Well, if you look at their own official register of terrorist incidents, they had more in the decades before 9/11 than they've had since.
Is that right?
Maybe that's because they weren't throwing the resources at it, or maybe it's a question of definition. But people forget, back in the 70s, there were a lot of hijackings in the world.
Indeed.
And sometimes a lot of people were killed. There were bombs on Air India plane in the mid-80s. In the 80s, you had a lot of embassy sieges, hostages, kidnappings. Yeah. Things which you're still seeing a little bit of, perhaps in North Africa, but these things do go in, I won't say fashions, but they do go in waves, and none of them lasts forever.
Yeah. I think that's technology may have caught up with that as well, and procedures, airport checking in procedures and stuff.
That's true. I mean, they will look for a way to get through the defences that we have.
Unaccompanied bag will not get on a plane in 2013, whereas 1987, why not? Put your bag on a plane and get in your car and drive away.
Yeah.
I mean, it's at airports that we have accepted the biggest inroads into our privacy. To take your shoe off and pour your water away and all the rest
Turbans
of it.
in Italy.
But I mean, who could say it isn't justified when you look at the possible consequences of a bomb on an aeroplane?
More turban searches throughout Europe now.
Yeah.
Curtailed freedom like you wouldn't believe. Italy, France has a turban ban in schools. So
issue with the hijab.
What you've got to watch is
it was
where
religious items, headwear. So the turban just got all included in with it anyway. And that's not really that public knowledge outside of France, to be fair. No one's really highlighted the fact that Sikh children haven't been to school in France for 2-3 years. Yeah. For the simple reason they wear a turban. No driving licences, you can't have a photo taken.
Well, that's why you've got to be so careful to verify that measures of that kind are actually required to meet a real terrorist threat, because it's very easy for them to go over into a sort of an element of we're not sure we like these people, or let's punish them, and that's very, very important that we don't get into that in this country.
Absolutely, and it shows you to what extent are their sources educating their government to some extent around understanding different racial and religious groups, for example. If you're saying that they haven't had Sikhs or Asians with certain attire going into schools, that means they're categorizing everybody in the same boat. So whether they, I don't know what their sociologists, whatever they're getting their sources from. Yeah. So basically that sort of it shows to us quite clearly, distinctly, that they're putting everybody in the same category. Yeah. So the question we have to ask now, then, if that be the case, when was the last time you saw a young Sikh man within the UK go out and commit or get involved in act of full-blown terrorism? We can understand and argue, racial tension, and when we see that's been just literally ongoing. Yeah. But to what extent have we seen a young Indian man of that origin? But yet, when it comes to monitoring, surveillance, when it comes to all the other issues, they seem to be put in the same category. I mean, obviously, they will be aware of all the stop and search that's taking place. Statistically, to what extent have they been particular groups more than other groups?
Racial profiling as opposed to
so
religious
that's back to the policing.
And I'd say one thing on stop and search, and here I will stick up for the government, because one thing this government thought when it came into power was maybe we have too many of these terrorism laws. Let's see if there are any that we can scale down or get rid of. Yes. And the main one they got rid of was the power to stop and search anybody on the street in order to see whether they were a terrorist or to see whether they were carrying terrorist materials. Now, in 1 year alone, 2009, 250,000 people were stopped on our streets under that power. Do you know how many of them were convicted of a criminal offence? None. Not one.
I was afraid to say it.
Not one was even charged. Now, a lot of them were in London, a lot of them were on the rail network. The police forces there said it's a very important power.
Yeah.
But the power was simply removed from 2010 when the government came into power. Since then, we've got through the royal wedding, we got through the Diamond Jubilee, we've had the torch relay, we've had the Olympics. All occasions where if this power had existed, I'm sure an awful lot of people would have been submitting to searches on the streets, and they didn't happen, and there were other ways of keeping us safe. So I think you have to give them credit for what was perhaps quite a brave political decision, although I would say that in the background was the European Court of Human Rights, saying we can't really see the point of this power.
There was a hand on the shoulder.
There was a hand on the shoulder, but I think the right result was reached, and it has very much reduced this grievance. Of course, you can still be stopped by people looking for a knife or for drugs, but you cannot be stopped without suspicion simply because somebody would like to find out what's in your bag and if it could be useful for terrorism.
Yeah. So that's actually been repealed completely?
Yeah, it's been replaced by a power which is so difficult to use that it's never been used, and that's in more than 2 years. So instead of 250,000 times in 1 year, you're looking at
Is that
zero.
Wise?
I think it's acceptable. I don't think the overall risk has been reduced. But there's a trade-off here, of course, with intelligence. I mean, we do have very good intelligence. Yeah. Now, in a way, exactly so, you take your choice. But if they didn't know what the really dangerous people were getting up to at home and on the internet and by email, then they might feel they needed the power to stop an awful lot of people on the streets and search their bags. Because I think intelligence coverage of particularly the Islamist threat, also increasingly the extreme right-wing threat, has been greatly improved over the last few years. I think there's a sense that we can just afford to relax a little bit. Stop and search is something that made a lot of people angry, particularly in minority ethnic communities. And it's something that actually we don't really need, except in areas where it's suspected that a terrorist incident is just about to take place, and that is now the only situation in which you can use it.
Imminently.
Yeah. And at the ports, where, as you say, there are special factors involving people travelling abroad for terrorism.
Yeah, and coming back as well. With regard to, I was saying earlier, I may have interrupted you inadvertently, with respect to Asian community in the UK, is there a terrorism sort of bookmark? Is there a view in Whitehall or government itself as to it's not just an Islamist threat, that Asian people have a tendency to be overexcitable quite quickly?
I spend quite a lot of time in the Home Office talking to people who are involved in that world. I mean, I've never heard any such idea. And if you were there in the secret part of the Home Office, I mean, you would see a surprising number of people there are Asian. I mean, it's not just a token one or two, I can tell you.
Yeah.
If you want to understand Asian communities, you need Asian people to play their part, and I can assure you that they do. You'd find just as many there as you would in any other workplace. And I think stereotypes like that have absolutely no place at all.
Right, brilliant. I was just wondering, because I was just thinking, when certain things are highlighted in the media, there's this blanket coverage of Sikh terrorists and LTTE terrorists, and it tends to stigmatise the whole community.
Well, I think when you ban a group, whether it's the International Sikh Youth Federation or whether it's the LTTE, the Tamil Tigers, there may be very good reasons for doing that. They may be committing terrorist acts. There might be funding, abroad. There might be funding flowing from England that needs to be cut off. I don't know, but I think if you're going to do that, you have to be very careful about the effect on the community itself, because there may be plenty of Tamil people who have nothing to do with the Tamil Tigers, but because they're Tamils, and because this organisation is proscribed, people might be interested in them. The police might be interested in them because they just want to check. And it may be the same with Sikhs, I don't know. I think that's one reason why we have to be very careful how we use this power to ban groups. Yeah. Fine to ban a group that is currently involved in terrorism, even if that's terrorism abroad against the government of one of our allies. But you've got to be very careful that it doesn't turn into a witch hunt at home, and that members of these communities who have nothing whatsoever to do with these organisations are left in peace to go about their everyday business.
Give and take, we've had these arrests, and Dave was aware when Sparky was quite local. To what extent did that create that sense of, uncertainty within the community? It must be all Asian, straight down from Stratford Road to Smallheath to Borsall. They're not going to literally to some extent just block off one road, it's the whole area, and I was under suspicion to some extent that there could be more filtering because of the mass volume of the ethnicity there, the mass volume of religious grouping there.
Yeah.
But are we going to be looking for the next potential terrorist to come from Kent somewhere, or somewhere in Macclesfield or somewhere? Well, obviously not to some extent. But,
was it Sparkhill, Stratford Road, where the cameras were taken down? They had CCTV.
Yeah. 2009, 10, I think.
That was directed at the community, was it? Was it not?
One of the arguments about spying and intelligence,
wasn't
there? There was all these things that began to come up,
and the community felt
very uncomfortable about that.
I think what that incident shows is that it's very important to reach out to communities, to empower communities, to give them the tools to combat radicalisation in their own community, but you can't confuse that with spying on people.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm afraid you do need to spy on people. There are some people who need to be spied on in order to keep us all safe. But you can't mix those two things. You know, if the police are involved in community outreach, it must be clear to everyone they're police. They're wearing uniforms. You know, they've got warrant cards. Everybody knows what they do and what they're there for. It's if you start blurring that boundary that I think you create mistrust. Because people start thinking, well, is that really a social worker or is it somebody else?
Yeah.
And again, I think that since Project Champion, I think that was a bit of a wake-up call. The cameras were removed, and since then, I think these boundaries have been reinforced.
And what responsibility does the community have itself?
I think.
What are the channels? What if I was at my local temple, and somebody was speaking about something that I weren't quite comfortable with?
I think in terms of
what would I do?
Of every individual's, or specific areas, but every individual's responsibility really is to look at some of the points that we've been saying today around the threat to the safety, the threat to the national security, threat to communities, threat to sort of certain people of racial. There's a whole lot of things that they need to take into consideration when something triggers some alarm bells, and I think everybody to some extent has got some definition or perception of what they see as terrorism, as opposed to somebody involved in kind of the more racial element of what we see with other groups. So I think there has to be that degree of responsibility from an individual to recognise, something's not right there. Okay, I'm not talking people having general conversations. You're walking in a road and talking about terrorism and 9/11. That's just your standard sort of conversation that tend to happen. But I would be a bit alarmed or suspicious if I was sitting in a cafe somewhere or wimping and I heard two people over talking. And giving you an example, and started talking about their intentions towards the government, the grievances, and they would like to sort of do something to sort of counter some of the things that have happened within their groups or religion. And in certain conversations that tend to go down a particular road that that's actually a dead end. So why are they going down that road before? So you have to gauge it, don't you, really, in terms of what would be classed as normal or acceptable, to oppose to what we class as.
I'm afraid there is a lot of chatter of that kind, and there are a lot more people who are prepared to chatter in a wimpy than there are who would actually have the motivation or the equipment to do anything violent. But I mean, it's true that if you do overhear somebody talking about using violence to attack civilians or to attack the police or the government or whatever, it's a serious matter, and you should have a word with the police. And in fact, a number of the plots that have been successfully foiled in the last couple of years have actually been with the help of the community. And a couple of Muslims up in Manchester who are planning attacks on Jewish people up there. Yeah, it's actually a family member who said to the police, I think he may be a homegrown terrorist. And we've seen similar things in Bristol, where someone's been effectively turned in by the community. It's not to say we should all be spying on each other, but I think as citizens, we all have a duty. If we see somebody else thinking seriously of committing a deadly crime, then we need to do something about it. And if we actually know, if we have information that someone is planning a terrorist act, we're actually legally obliged to tell the police, because they can actually prosecute you if you don't. And we saw, for example, some of the relatives of the 21/7 bombers who failed to detonate their. They were prosecuted for that. They knew what was going on. They didn't tell the police.
And sisters and stuff like
that. It's not very nice, but it's a criminal offence.
And then that is the preservation of exercising our kind of rights for preservation. Be it talking God made us, be it with the perspective we kind of look at it from. So we are preserving life rather than take it to the full extent where people's the ultimate cost here and sacrifice is death, really, isn't it? Really, for the full blown attack, because that's the whole intention of terrorists, which is to cause mass casualties within more open places, isn't it? Rather than just have an audience there. That's the whole
Spread
intention.
terror.
Yeah, and incite fear, isn't it? Really,
Yeah,
incite fear into
fear
local communities. So listen, we're telling you, it's better to do it.
David, what is the definition of terrorism?
Oh, don't start.
The government.
We really want that one.
The government definition, the law, the legal definition.
Yeah, it's an act of violence, basically, which has the intention of well, it must be politically motivated or religiously motivated or ideologically motivated,
yeah.
or indeed racially motivated, and it must have the intention either of influencing the government or intimidating the public or a section of the public.
Right.
I mean, it's a very complicated definition, but I think the main point is that it applies to any government in the world. So we don't distinguish between terrorists and freedom fighters. You know, bad violent people and good violent people.
Yeah.
Under the law, there are no good violent people.
Violence is violence.
So, I mean, to take even Nelson Mandela, when he was with the ANC, he would have been a terrorist under the law. Of course, whether someone like that is prosecuted for an offence in England or Scotland or Wales, completely different
He
matter.
would have been at the time.
When you have as broad a definition of that, you're saying effectively anyone who takes up violent action against their government anywhere in the world for political reasons is a terrorist. You can't hope to prosecute them all or keep tabs on them all or anything else. So we are very reliant on our police, our prosecutors, and our juries showing good sense and interpreting this in a proportionate way. Parliament tried to produce a list of bad terrorists and people that we didn't mind too much, but they couldn't do it. The opinions were so different. No one was ever going to agree whether this group was a good group or a bad group. So in the end, they went for the broad definition, and they've left the police and the courts to sort it out.
Which is democracy, really.
It's democracy, yes, it's democracy. But it does make a job like mine all the more necessary, I think, because when you have very broad powers, it's particularly important to check that they're being properly used.
Yeah, the implementation is everything.
Yeah.
David, thank you.
Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure to speak
Great
to
pleasure.
you. Thank you very much for coming today. That's all we've got time for today. I hope you enjoyed the conversation we've had with David Anderson QC and Jasmine Borough, Community Coordinator for Terrorism in the local communities in Birmingham and the Midlands. Again, thank you for watching and I hope you enjoyed it. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.